The alarm screamed through the military base at 3 a.m. "Suspicious package in Building C," the announcement echoed. 23-year-old Lieutenant Jake Morrison ran toward the scene, but stopped cold when he saw the quiet cargo worker, the same man who'd been sorting mail for 3 years, calmly walking toward the potential bomb. "Sir, you need to evacuate," Jake shouted. The man turned around with eyes that had seen too much war and said 5 words that changed everything. "Son, I know what this is. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. We're growing every day and truly appreciate you being part of our community." The night shift Fort Harrison had been Jake Morrison's home for 8 months now. Fresh out of West Point, the young lieutenant was still adjusting to military life beyond the academy's structured environment. The supply depot where he'd been assigned wasn't exactly the combat deployment he'd dreamed of, but it was important work, managing the flow of equipment and supplies that kept the base operational. The night shift was usually quiet. A skeleton crew of soldiers and civilian contractors handling late deliveries and processing morning shipments. Jake had grown accustomed to the routine. Check manifests, supervise loading, ensure security protocols were followed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Tom Sullivan had been part of that routine for as long as Jake could remember. The 58-year-old cargo handler arrived every night at exactly 10 p.m., punched his time card, and went to work sorting packages in the main receiving area. He was efficient, reliable, and almost invisible. In 8 months, Jake couldn't recall having a real conversation with the man beyond basic work-related exchanges. Tom kept to himself, which wasn't unusual for civilian contractors on military bases. Many were former service members who preferred the steady work without the military structure. Others were simply local residents who needed the job. Tom fell into that grey area where nobody asked too many questions as long as the work got done. What Jake had noticed, though he'd never really thought about it, was how methodically Tom worked. While other handlers moved packages quickly to meet quotas, Tom examined each item carefully. He seemed to read every label, check every seal, and had an odd habit of listening to certain packages, actually putting his ear against them as if hearing something others couldn't. The other workers had jokes about Tom's quirks. "Old Tom's checking for Christmas presents," they'd say, or "He's making sure nothing's broken inside." Jake had laughed along, but now, as he watched Tom walking calmly toward what might be an explosive device, those quirks took on a different meaning. The suspicious item had arrived on the last delivery of the evening. A brown cardboard box, roughly the size of a shoebox, with routing labels that didn't quite match standard military shipping protocols. The delivery driver, a contractor from off-base, had seemed nervous when he dropped it off. Said he'd been told it was urgent, but couldn't explain why he'd been asked to deliver it at such an unusual hour. Jake's training kicked in immediately. Suspicious package protocols were drilled into every officer. Don't touch, don't move, evacuate the area, call EOD, explosive ordnance disposal. The base alarm system was designed for exactly this kind of situation. But as the evacuation siren wailed and personnel began clearing the building, Tom Sullivan was moving in the opposite direction. Not running toward the package with reckless abandon, but walking with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly what he was dealing with. "Mr. Sullivan," Jake called out, his voice barely audible over the alarm. "You need to evacuate. This area is being cleared." Tom paused and looked back at the young lieutenant. There was something in his expression that Jake had never seen before. Not concern or fear, but a kind of calm recognition. Like a mechanic looking at a broken engine he'd fixed 1,000 times before. "Lieutenant Morrison," Tom said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "How long have you been stationed here?" The question was so unexpected that Jake almost forgot about the potential explosive device 20 feet away. 8 months, sir. But we need to evacuate. Yodi is en route." 8 months, Tom repeated, nodding. "And in those 8 months, how many suspicious packages have we had?" Jake thought for a moment. "This is the first one, but first one you've seen," Tom corrected. "There have been others. Small incidents. False alarms. Things that got handled quietly before they became emergencies." The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" Tom Sullivan looked at the package, then back at Jake. "Son, I know what this is." The revelation the next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Tom approached the suspicious package with movements that were precise, deliberate, professional. He knelt beside it, not touching but examining it from multiple angles. Jake watched, frozen between his duty to evacuate and a growing realization that he was witnessing something extraordinary. "The wiring is visible through this corner," Tom said, pointing to a spot where the cardboard had been slightly damaged in shipping. "See how the tape has been applied? 2 layers, different adhesive types. The person who made this wanted it to look professional, but didn't have proper training." Jake moved closer despite every protocol telling him to maintain distance. "How do you know all this?" Tom's hands moved with surgical precision as he carefully peeled back a small section of tape. 22 years, Lieutenant. Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Places where packages like this were a daily occurrence. "You were EOD?" "Team leader," Tom confirmed, his attention focused entirely on the device. "Handled over 300 explosive devices in combat zones. This one's amateur work, but it's real." Jake felt his world shifting. The quiet cargo handler who'd sorted mail for 3 years, who'd been invisible background noise in the depot's daily operations, was one of the most experienced bomb disposal experts the military had ever produced. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why are you working as a cargo handler?" Tom paused in his examination. "Some chapters of life have to end before new ones can begin, Lieutenant. I did my time in places where every package could kill you. When I came home, I wanted a job where packages were just packages. But you're still doing it. You're still defusing bombs." "No," Tom corrected. "I'm preventing a young officer from making a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his career." The comment stung, but Jake knew it was accurate. His impulse had been to follow protocol without really understanding what he was dealing with. Tom's approach was based on experience that couldn't be learned from manuals. The process what followed was a masterclass in explosive ordnance disposal. Tom worked with tools that appeared from pockets Jake hadn't known existed in a standard work uniform. Small instruments, wire cutters, diagnostic equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything in the base's official EOD kit. The maker used a simple timer mechanism, Tom explained as he worked, but they've added a motion sensor as a backup. If someone had tried to move this package before understanding its design, it would have detonated. Jake felt sick. The standard protocol would have involved moving the package to a secure area for EOD examination. We would have set it off. Probably. The motion sensor is crude but functional. It would have triggered if the package had been tilted more than 15 degrees from horizontal. Tom's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd performed this procedure hundreds of times. Every movement was economical, purposeful, safe. Jake found himself holding his breath as Tom traced wires, identified components, and gradually dismantled the device. "The explosive is commercial grade," Tom continued, his voice maintaining the same calm tone he'd used when discussing shipping manifests. "Maybe half a pound. Enough to kill anyone in a 10-foot radius and cause significant damage to the building. Who would do this? Why target a supply depot?" Tom paused in his work to look at Jake directly. "Lieutenant, this isn't about the depot. This is about testing security responses. Someone wanted to see how long it would take for EOD to arrive, what evacuation procedures would be followed, how the base would handle a potential explosive threat." The implications were staggering. This wasn't a random act of violence, but reconnaissance for something larger. "We need to notify command immediately." "We will," Tom agreed, returning his attention to the device. "But first, we need to make sure this thing doesn't go off." The final phase of the disarmament process took another 10 minutes. Tom worked with the patience of a surgeon, explaining each step to Jake as he isolated circuits, disabled sensors, and finally removed the explosive component entirely. When it was finished, the device lay in separate pieces on the floor. What had been a potentially deadly weapon was now a collection of wires, batteries, and electronic components that looked almost harmless. "It's safe," Tom announced, sitting back on his heels. Jake stared at the dismantled bomb, then at Tom. The magnitude of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. "You just saved lives. Maybe dozens of lives." Tom began carefully placing the components into an evidence bag. "I prevented a problem from becoming a tragedy. There's a difference." The questions as the immediate crisis passed, Jake found himself grappling with questions that went far beyond the evening's events. The man he'd worked alongside for 8 months, whom he'd barely noticed, had just demonstrated expertise that could have made him wealthy in the private security sector or earned him high-ranking positions in military EOD units. "Tom," Jake said as they waited for the official EOD team to arrive for evidence collection, "why are you really here? With your experience, you could be anywhere doing anything." Tom was cleaning his improvised tools with the same methodical care he'd used to disarm the bomb. "Lieutenant Morrison, let me ask you something. What do you think success looks like?" The question caught Jake off guard. "I don't understand." "Success. Achievement. Making your life count. What does that look like to you?" Jake thought for a moment. "Making a difference. Serving something bigger than yourself. Having an impact. And you think working as a cargo handler doesn't meet that definition?" "Well, no. I mean, it's honest work, but with your skills." Tom smiled, the first genuine expression Jake had seen from him. "Tonight, Lieutenant, what happened here? You disarmed a bomb. Before that, what was I doing before the alarm went off?" Jake tried to remember. "Sorting packages. Checking shipping manifests." "Right. And in the course of sorting packages and checking manifests, what did I find?" The realization dawned slowly. Irregularities. Things that didn't match standard protocols. "This package didn't arrive tonight by accident," Tom explained. "It was delivered to test our security, but it was also delivered because someone knew our routines, our procedures, our vulnerabilities. The only way to identify those vulnerabilities is to understand the system from the inside." Jake felt like he was seeing the supply depot, his job, even Tom himself, from an entirely different perspective. "You've been watching, monitoring, looking for threats." "I've been doing my job," Tom corrected. "The job I was hired to do, and the job I trained for 22 years to do. They're not as different as you might think." The truth over the next hour, as they waited for investigators and debriefing officers, Tom shared pieces of his story. Not the complete picture. Jake sensed there were chapters that would remain classified, but enough to understand the man behind the janitor's uniform. He'd been Master Sergeant Thomas Sullivan, team leader for one of the military's most elite EOD units. His record included deployments to every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades. He'd saved countless lives, earned decorations Jake could only dream of, and built a reputation among explosive ordnance disposal specialists that bordered on legendary. "So why leave?" Jake asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Have you ever seen what happens when an EOD specialist makes a mistake, Lieutenant?" Jake shook his head. "I hope you never do. But after 22 years, you've seen it enough times to know that every success is borrowed time. Every bomb you disarm is a gamble with odds that eventually catch up with everyone in this business. You burned out." "I got smart," Tom corrected. "I realized that the best way to keep serving wasn't necessarily the most obvious way." Jake was beginning to understand. "So you took a position where you could monitor potential threats without the pressure of active duty." "I took a position where I could use my experience to prevent problems rather than just solve them. Most explosive devices that target military installations start with reconnaissance. Understanding shipping procedures, security protocols, personnel routines. The best place to detect that reconnaissance is from inside the system they're studying." It was brilliant, Jake realized. Tom hadn't retired from bomb disposal. He'd evolved into threat prevention. His position as a cargo handler gave him access to every package, every delivery, every irregularity that might indicate hostile surveillance. "How many have there been? Threats like tonight?" "This is the first actual device," Tom said. "But there have been 12 suspicious packages, 6 deliveries with incorrect documentation, and 3 shipping patterns that suggested someone was testing our response times." Jake stared at him. 12 suspicious packages? I never heard about any of them, because they were handled quietly. Sometimes the best security is invisible security. The recognition when the official EOD team arrived, led by Captain Sarah Chun. Jake watched another layer of Tom's story unfold. Captain Chun was a 15-year veteran, one of the base's most experienced officers. When she saw Tom, her expression changed from professional concern to something approaching reverence. "Master Sergeant Sullivan," she said, dropping the standard protocol of rank-based address. "I should have known." Tom nodded acknowledgement. "Captain Chun, the device is disarmed and bagged for analysis. Components suggest amateur construction, but functional design." Captain Chun examined the evidence with the same methodical precision Jake had watched Tom use. Motion sensor backup on a timer device. Crude but effective. Professional assessment. Reconnaissance operation. Someone wanted to test our response protocols and timing. The device was real enough to trigger full evacuation procedures, but not sophisticated enough to suggest military-grade expertise. Jake listened to the exchange with growing amazement. These two were speaking a professional language he barely understood, discussing technical details that weren't covered in any training manual he'd studied. "Sir," he interrupted, Captain Chin, you know Mr. Sullivan? Captain Chin looked at Jake with surprise. Lieutenant, you don't know who this is? I know he just saved lives tonight by disarming a bomb. Lieutenant Morrison, Captain Chin said. Master Sergeant Sullivan is a legend in EOD circles. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, credited with over 300 successful disposals in combat conditions. He's the person they use to train instructors at EOD school. Jake felt his understanding of the evening's events shifting again. You're famous. Tom looked uncomfortable with the attention. I'm retired. You're working as a cargo handler, Captain Chin said, not hiding her confusion. Sir, with respect, what are you doing here? Tom's answer was the same one he'd given Jake. Serving in the way that makes the most sense for this stage of my life. Captain Chin accepted the explanation, but Jake could see she found it as puzzling as he did. A master sergeant with Tom's record could write his own ticket in the private sector, command elite units, or teach at the highest levels of military education. Instead, he was sorting packages on a night shift at a supply depot. But as Jake watched Tom interact with the EOD team, he began to see the wisdom in his choice. Tom wasn't wasting his talents. He was applying them in a way that prevented crises, rather than just responding to them. His position gave him insights into base operations that no traditional security role could provide. The lesson as the investigation wrapped up and normal operations slowly resumed, Jake found himself alone with Tom in the supply depot. The adrenaline of the evening was wearing off, replaced by a deeper understanding of what had happened and what it meant. Tom, he said, I owe you an apology. For what? For not seeing you. For 8 months, I worked alongside you and never really noticed who you were or what you were capable of. Tom resumed his work, checking manifests and organizing packages as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Lieutenant, the best compliment you can give someone in my line of work is not noticing them until you need them. But you could be doing so much more. Tom paused in his work to look at Jake directly. More according to whom? Tonight, a potential terrorist attack was prevented. Base security was preserved. Lives were saved. How is that not enough? Jake struggled to articulate what he was feeling. It's just your experience, your skills. You're working below your capabilities. Am I? Tom asked. Or am I working exactly at my capabilities in the way that serves the most people? The question forced Jake to examine his own assumptions about success, recognition, and service. He'd been raised in a military culture that valued visible achievement, clear hierarchies, and advancement through the ranks. Tom represented a different model. Service without recognition, impact without advancement, success measured in crises prevented rather than battles won. You chose this position specifically, Jake realized. I requested this assignment after my retirement was approved. I knew the base, understood the vulnerabilities, and recognized that the best way to address those vulnerabilities was from the inside. Jake nodded slowly. And you've been watching ever since. I've been serving ever since. Just not in the way most people would recognize. As the night shift ended and day personnel began arriving, Jake watched Tom punch his time card and head home, just like he had for the past 8 months. But everything was different now. Jake would never again see him as just a cargo handler. He was a guardian, a protector, a man who'd found a way to continue serving his country long after most people would have considered his service complete. The aftermath in the weeks that followed, Jake found himself paying attention to details he'd previously overlooked. The way Tom examined certain packages, the questions he asked about delivery schedules and shipping procedures, the careful notes he kept about irregularities and patterns. What looked like the routine work of a cargo handler was actually sophisticated surveillance, conducted by someone with the experience to recognize threats that would be invisible to less trained eyes. Tom wasn't just sorting mail. He was conducting ongoing security assessment of base operations. The investigation into the night's bomb threat revealed exactly what Tom had suspected. The device was part of a larger surveillance operation targeting multiple military installations. The goal was to test response times, evacuation procedures, and security protocols, information that could be used to plan more serious attacks. Thanks to Tom's intervention, the base's actual capabilities remained unknown to potential adversaries. The official record would show that EOD had successfully disabled the device within standard response time parameters. The fact that it had been disarmed by a cargo handler with improvised tools would remain classified. Jake never saw Tom receive official recognition for what he'd done. There was no ceremony, no medal, no promotion. Just a quiet notation in a classified file that would probably never be read by anyone outside intelligence circles. But Jake also realized that recognition wasn't what Tom was seeking. He'd found a way to continue doing the work he'd trained for his entire adult life, but in a context that allowed him to prevent crises rather than just respond to them. The legacy months later, Jake was promoted to a position with broader security responsibilities. His first recommendation was to establish better communication between cargo handling operations and base security. His second was to recognize that the most valuable intelligence often comes from the people who seem least important in an organization's hierarchy, that he never forgot the lesson Tom had taught him that night. That service takes many forms, that the most important work is often invisible, and that true expertise sometimes chooses to operate from the shadows rather than in the spotlight. Jake never learned all the details of Tom's military career, but he didn't need to. He'd seen enough in one evening to understand that some people serve their entire lives, in ways both visible and invisible, recognized and unrecognized. And sometimes, late at night, when he was reviewing security reports or analyzing potential threats, Jake would remember the calm voice saying, "Son, I know what this is." And he would understand that the most important protections often come from the places we least expect to find them. Tom Sullivan continued working the night shift at the supply depot, sorting packages, checking manifests, and watching for irregularities that might threaten the safety of people who would never know his name. Because some heroes work in silence, serve without recognition, and find their purpose in preventing the crises that others would have to solve. And that, Jake learned, might be the most important kind of service of all.